I want to welcome all of you to this conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you. As you see this, I'll be on the way to Beijing. But I did want to have the opportunity, first, to welcome you, and second, to have an opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. My name is Bob Hormats. I'm currently Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates in New York. I used to be, several years ago, Undersecretary of State under Hillary Clinton for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. And prior to that, I was Vice Chairman International for Goldman Sachs. Had the opportunity to work very closely with Raj Cohn and Sullivan, Cromwell, and many others who are in this audience. So I'm very pleased to be with you and share my thoughts with you. And I know this is going to be an interesting conference because the subjects are great, and I know RANE has worked very hard to put together a very good group of people with a very provocative and very intense agenda for addressing the really important issues that many of us, myself and many of you, face, or if you don't face them today, you'll perhaps face them down the road. The conference is designed to look at various aspects of risk in a very rapidly evolving global and domestic environment. And the notions of risk change. The types of risk we're going to face over the next several years will be considerably different in many cases from the risks that we've faced in the past. They stem from political changes, changes in public attitude, changes in the economy and various economies around the world, and changes in technology, as well as various threats to security, both domestic and international, around the world. So there's a panoply of new risks, also new opportunities. So I think when we look at risks, we also have to look at opportunities. But this is a way of trying to put a lot of these things in context, weigh them in terms of their level of probability and the kind of impact they'll have on us if some of these risks that we're talking about do in fact materialize. Many companies are addressing risk, not just cyber, but various other kinds of risk of terrorism, risk of interruption of supply chains, a variety of risks to the information and trade secrets that they have. But there's also an area that I think has received a little less attention. Not to say we've resolved the cyber issues, because we have a long way to go and they're evolving in a very dramatic way. But we also have a different category of risk, and that is that the notion that we had, many of us had, over the last 10 years or so, that globalization would continue, we'd have an unfettered and seamless global internet, that information would flow around the world rapidly and seamlessly, that governments would continue to pursue the Western liberal economic and political and organizational model of working with one another. That is all up in the air as well. You have very strong populist movements who don't necessarily like the continuation of globalization and want to pull back from it. You have threats of information nationalism around the world that can make the internet a less secure and less effective instrument for doing business or communicating, less trusted in many parts of the world, and more troublesome in terms of intervening in national politics or in businesses or in governments, or in whipping up, as we've seen in the cases of ISIS, various supporters to do highly disruptive things to our systems and our economies. So the notion of risk is changing, and companies are already getting on top of it. But the problem is whether they can stay ahead of the game, or that the risks begin to pile up and companies find themselves struggling to stay ahead of the game. The broader issue is that international institutions have really not kept up with the kinds of evolving or revolutionary changes in risk. There's really no device for dealing with cyber disruptions, cyber intrusion, cyber terrorism. There are no rules of the game that have been agreed to in a broad sense. What constitutes a threat? How do you retaliate against these kinds of actions? How do you ensure proper attribution if you're the victim of some kind of cyber terrorism or cyber disruption? These are really rapidly changing issues that international institutions simply can't keep up with. And I think the same is true with governments in terms of the risks internally. We're struggling to try to understand what risks we face. And also, in another sense, risks to the global trading system, risks to the international financial system. A lot of work has been done to enhance financial cooperation, and I think progress has actually been made there in dealing with a multitude of issues. But the US and Europe have very different views on various aspects of bank regulation, for instance. On trade, there is a whole area of international trade that is not covered by the WTO, where countries or regions can develop their own rules, and we're seeing a sort of regionalization of trade negotiations, particularly in Asia, whereas the US is now pulling back or pulling out of TPP. So are the rules of the 21st century, as they're written over the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years, going to be conducive to the kind of global order that the United States has promoted since the end of World War II? Or are we going to see a more statist approach, more nationalistic approach, restrictions on access to information, restrictions on certain kinds of technology? Those risks of a more systemic nature, I think, are going to have to be taken into account as well. Who would have thought that there would be interference from abroad in the American electoral process? This is an area that probably wouldn't have been imagined 5 years ago, but we've seen various pieces of evidence that it has happened, and figuring out the exact attribution is something that's going to have to be done by American security services, and figuring out what to do about it. That's a big challenge. The global trading system, again, as I said, we thought it would be smooth and orderly. There could be major disruptions. There could be a major retreat from trade globalization. There could be trade wars. There could be investment wars down the road, depending on the policies taken by this incoming administration and other countries as well. It may not happen. It may happen. We have to be aware of it. The differences across borders and across oceans and the way the banking system is regulated could lead to a number of disruptions. The politics in various countries, in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere, have become more populist. That could lead to major changes in the way countries are governed, much more nationalism, much more xenophobia. And of course, terrorism has been centered of late on ISIS, but ISIS has morphed and has extended itself to various parts of the world. And no country can rest assured that it is not going to be a target for various kinds of disruption or terrorism coming out of ISIS, or not just ISIS, but other groups as well. So we're in a world that really is likely to be more fragmented and less cohesive in dealing with some of these issues. Even though many of these issues are global threats, many countries have more nationalistic ways of addressing the world than before, and politics may make it more difficult. Domestic populist politics may make it more difficult for governments to come together. On the other hand, governments are going to have to figure out a way of dealing with the underlying reasons for the kind of populism that we're seeing in the US and Europe is seeing in Europe. These are people who, in many cases, have very legitimate concerns about the system leaving them behind or marginalizing them, or their leaders are not listening to them or doing things that they care about that help them improve their lives. So unless societies and governments are able to address the problems that people have in adjusting to the changes in technology, adjusting to changes in globalization, adjusting to changes in competition, these people who feel left behind and marginalized are going to continue to be there, and they will constitute major groups that will have a strong political voice, and governments are going to have to figure out, and companies, businesses, are going to have to figure out a way of adjusting to and helping, in particular, these people to overcome the kinds of concerns that are legitimate. I think in many cases, we in the United States and in many countries in Europe, we don't know one another. I think Americans who live in New York or Los Angeles or various parts of the country really need to understand better what's going on in Middle America. We can't afford to have two Americas, one doing very well and one benefiting from technology and one benefiting from globalization, and another which feels that technology has caused major disruptions in their lives. They're not profiting or benefiting from it. They're being harmed by globalization. This kind of divide presents a major risks, and the people who are in positions of authority, both in the government and the private sector, and in the academic sector, have to understand that there are legitimate grievances, and if you can't just sweep them under the rug or pretend they didn't happen. They voiced themselves very strongly in this election, and we have to figure out ways of addressing their concerns. And the same is true in Europe. We just can't wish these things away, because they do present an underlying social force that may make a lot of changes, or want a lot of changes in the way our country is governed. And some of them may be xenophobic and highly populistic, but they're there, and we have to figure out how to address them if we want to have a stable society. You can't have international economic leadership unless people at home feel that their concerns are being dealt with, their need for jobs and better wages is being addressed. These are part of dealing with the broader question of global risk. Deal with the concerns at home, otherwise you won't have a credible international economic policy, or governments won't have the ability to conduct international economic policy and improve the global order. There are people who understand that adjustments, and indeed more than adjustments, significant changes have to be made, but I believe it's just beginning to dawn on a lot of people how urgent it is to do this. And we, in many ways, don't know exactly how to do it. It's not as if people in the past, and past administrations and the current administration, don't want to do it. It's very difficult to do. The economy has recovered only very slowly from the Great Recession. I think there are ways of doing it. I do think that a strong program in the area of infrastructure is a very good thing. I've been advocating this for many years. I think also an educational system and a training system that is much more closely linked to the potential jobs, not just of today, but of the future, is very important. I think that dealing with income inequality and finding some techniques for doing this in a way that we've not done in the past is a good idea. When I was in the State Department, I was managing for the State Department international economic policy. I made a point of going to various parts of the country that were disadvantaged by internationalization, by globalization, by global trade, by the financial crisis. Gary, Indiana, Hammond, Indiana, Hamtramck, Michigan, New Orleans, and various other places. And there is a very real problem in those places. These people are desperate. Just to make ends meet is very difficult for them. And somehow I think that you look in the red and the blue states in this latest election, and you see this sort of divide between the two coasts and the center of America. And I think that people are going to have to figure out, people who are governing this country and people who are running companies really need to get to know America better, and particularly the middle classes and the workers of this country who simply don't think they're being listened to. This is not just going to manifest itself in elections. These are real issues, and they will put pressure on the governance process unless the governance process is better able. and more urgently willing to address their needs. I mean, these are underlying risks to the system because the risks that people feel in their everyday lives aren't being addressed. And unless we deal with the risks in their everyday lives, the system itself is going to be divided. Lincoln called it a house divided. We live in a house divided now in this country, and we have to come to grips with that on a much more urgent basis. And people feel that Washington has not done this. How many people sitting around central Manhattan really know how difficult the lives of people in Gary and Hannibal, Indiana are? There's a great story about Gandhi when he came back from Durban in South Africa. He really didn't know much about India. He was a lawyer in Durban, South Africa, and he was told by colleagues in the Congress Party, go find India, and which meant travel around India, which he did on a train. If anyone's seen the movie Gandhi, that's what he did. I think people who are in charge of policy, but also businesses, people who really want to help to reduce this divide and provide more opportunity, have to spend some time understanding what the problems are and where they are, and go there and see them and talk to people. This to me is critical. Otherwise, we're going to have major divisions in our country, and it'll be very harmful to the people who are disadvantaged, but it'll be harmful to everyone in the long run. American businesses, in many instances, are actually doing the right things. I'm constantly impressed with the training programs that a lot of businesses have for identifying the kinds of jobs that are needed in the future and working with the school systems everywhere in this country. I see a lot of concern and a lot of attention by big business to helping to work with or support local schools, high schools, community colleges, junior colleges, universities, research centers. I think that is happening. I'll give you an example. In San Diego, Qualcomm and other companies in the region have put together something called Tech for Tech, which is a system of high schools where they help to train and support people who want to learn about technology, who can develop the skills to work for companies in the San Diego region. This is done in similar ways in other parts of the country as well, but I think it is not done on a large enough scale. So I don't think, and I think mayors and governors are trying to do this. You know, we have in New York a number of programs to help younger people learn new technologies and develop the skills they're going to need. But in many cases, you can develop a skill today for what you think is a job that you're going to be able to get. And 3 or 4 years from now, technology has rendered that job irrelevant, in the sense that new technology has displaced the old technology. People who are able to use the old technology don't necessarily know how to deal with the new disruptive, fast-changing technology. So you really have to keep the educational and training process up in a very rigorous way over the longer term. I think businesses are actually, and mayors and governors are actually doing this. And a lot of the answers to these problems are not coming from the federal level. They're coming from business, they're coming from state governments, they're coming from local governments. But it needs to be done on a much broader basis, and you have to keep up with the rapid pace of change. You can't just be treading water. It has to be done much more rapidly. And I see in various parts of the country that many people just don't think it is. And the widening of the income gap and the sort of fairness gap that we see in this country convinces a lot of people that companies may be doing very well, but they, if you're in Des Moines or Gary, Indiana, or many other places, you just don't feel you're able to keep up, and you in fact feel you're falling behind. So something has to be done along those lines to address that kind of issue. We really need to take a very hard look at what's happening in this country internally. The Europeans need to do the same, but we need to take a look at what's happening in this country internally, because unless we get it right and give people a sense that there are rising opportunities for all of us, or for the vast majority of Americans, even though the economy numerically is now growing at nearly 3%, the benefits for large numbers of people are not enormous, and many people see disadvantages. So unless we're able to sort of heal those divisions over a period of time with ways of improving opportunity, we've got a problem. This is not to say it's easy. If it were easy, it would have been done already, but it is urgently needed, and that's, I think, important to the system, not just today, but tomorrow. And people who feel that they're not vulnerable to this, that they're doing well, they're earning a lot of money, they're living in a nice house and a nice community, that and companies that feel that they're doing quite well, even despite all this, that may be true for a period of time. But if you look at the history of various societies, if divisions of this sort continue, then there are going to be much stronger demands for very dramatic changes that will affect large numbers of people who feel, for the moment, that they're not vulnerable. And I think this is what needs to be dealt with. So in answer to one of the earlier questions, are we doing enough? Are we aware enough? We may be aware at a general level, but we're really not aware of the depth of the problems that large numbers of Americans feel. And we don't have programs that are scalable enough or bold enough to really address those. Again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over a period of time. But unless there is a more effective way of doing it, that's a problem. We can't ignore it. We can't ignore that people have these problems, but we're not going to be able to have a cohesive society without dealing with that. And we're not going to be able to have an effective role in the global economy in particular unless we're able to demonstrate that we're able to deal with the problems we have at home. You can't lead abroad effectively if you have a divided and acrimoniously, as we do now, divided society at home. It just undermines your ability to lead. After World War II, we had a very united society. There were certainly partisan issues between Republicans and Democrats, but the general notion of our society was they were working together, that when companies prosper, workers prospered. Then we had a sense of national cohesion. And that enabled us to play a very effective leadership role. If you have a society that's fragmented, that's fractured, where institutions don't enjoy the trust of large numbers of Americans, and they don't. Government doesn't, the press doesn't, big business doesn't, financial institutions don't. If you have the major institutions of our society being distrusted by large numbers of Americans, it's very hard for people to follow their leaders and the benefits that they can gain from closer cooperation between business and labor if they don't have confidence in the fundamental institutions of our system. And those have been eroded, and I think the recent campaign has eroded them further. The notion that you follow elites, you follow the establishment, it has a lot of experience, it's going to lead our country in the right direction. A lot of people don't believe that. And institutions, leaders, our system, government, business has to reestablish a credibility, and not just by saying things, but actually figuring out how to deal with these internal issues. We're a very resilient country, and we have come back in the past and pulled together in the past. The question is whether we can do that again. And a lot of what the future holds for us really hangs in the balance as to whether we can do that or not. Thank you very much for listening. Again, I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I know you're going to have a very productive conversation, and I wish you well, and I look forward to hearing the results of your discussions. All the best.